There are things in this world that know your name, not because they learned it, not because someone told them, but because they listened. They waited in the spaces between words, in the silence after conversations, in the moments when you introduced yourself to strangers without realizing something else was also listening. They collected these names the way some people collect stamps or coins, except they had no interest in keeping them safe. They wanted to use them. And when they finally did, when they called out to you in a voice that sounded almost human but not quite, you had only one choice. Do not answer. This is a story about people who heard their names spoken in the darkness. This is a story about a rule that saved lives, even though no one could explain why it existed. This is a story about something that walks through the forest, something that knows who you are, something that wants you to respond. And this is a story about what happens to those who forget that real fear does not come from things that attack. Real fear comes from things that know you. If you are subscribed and you have liked this video, we are diving into the darkness. The forest had a rule that everyone knew but no one ever explained. Parents taught it to their children with a firmness that left no room for questions. Teachers mentioned it in passing when field trips were planned near the tree line. Even the oldest residents, the ones who had lived through wars and droughts and winters that killed livestock, spoke of it with the same quiet certainty they reserved for facts like gravity and death. The rule was simple. If you heard your name called in the woods after dark, you did not answer. You did not turn around. You did not investigate. You walked away, and you never looked back. No one could say where the rule came from. Some claimed it dated back to the original settlers, whispered warnings passed down through generations like heirlooms no one wanted but everyone kept. Others insisted it was older than that, something the native people who had lived here first knew instinctively, a truth written into the land itself. There were stories, of course. There were always stories. But they had a strange quality to them, a way of trailing off just when they should have reached their climax. Someone would start to tell what happened to their cousin or their neighbor or a friend of a friend, and then their voice would falter. They would look away. They would say they had forgotten the rest, or that it did not matter, or that they had to go. The stories never ended. They just stopped. The town sat at the edge of a forest that stretched for miles in every direction, dense and dark and older than anyone could measure. During the day it was beautiful in the way wild places often are, all dappled sunlight and birdsong and the smell of pine and earth. Hikers came from other counties to walk the trails. Photographers set up their equipment to capture the way the light filtered through the canopy. Children played at its edges, building forts from fallen branches and pretending to be explorers. But when the sun went down, everything changed. The forest became something else. The sounds shifted. The shadows deepened. And people stayed away. It was not fear, exactly. Or maybe it was, but not the kind that came with screaming or running or locked doors. It was quieter than that. It was the kind of fear that made you careful, the kind that kept you from doing something stupid without ever really explaining why. You did not test the rule. You did not dare the darkness. You did not stand at the tree line after sunset and call out to see what might answer. Because even if you did not believe in the stories, even if you thought the whole thing was superstition or old wives' tales or mass hysteria, there was still something in the air when the light faded. Something that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. Something that whispered in a voice too quiet to hear that you should not be here, that you were not wanted, that you should go home. The first incident that people talked about openly happened 3 decades ago, though there were hints of others before it, fragments of stories that no one would confirm. A young man had been hiking alone, something people did back then without much thought. He had lost track of time. the way hikers sometimes do, and found himself deep in the woods as the sun began to set. He was experienced enough to know he should have turned back earlier, but he was also close to the trail that would lead him out, and he thought he could make it before full dark. He was wrong. By the time he realized how disoriented he had become, the light was almost gone. The trees around him were black silhouettes against a sky that had turned the color of a bruise. He stopped walking and tried to get his bearings, listening for the sound of the road or the creek or anything that might tell him which direction to go. That was when he heard it. His name. Clear as anything. Not shouted, not whispered. Just spoken, in a normal conversational tone, as if someone were standing a few feet away trying to get his attention. He froze. His first thought was relief. Someone else was out here. Someone who knew him. Someone who could help him find his way back. He opened his mouth to call back, to say he was here, to ask for help. But something stopped him. The voice had been strange. Not wrong, exactly, but not quite right either. The tone was too even. The pronunciation too careful. It was his name, but it sounded like someone reading it off a page, someone who had never said it out loud before and was trying their best to get it right. He did not answer. He stood there in the growing darkness, his heart pounding, and he did not make a sound. The voice came again. Same tone. Same careful pronunciation. His name, spoken into the empty air like a question. He realized with a creeping sense of wrongness that there had been no footsteps, no rustling of leaves, no sound of anyone moving through the underbrush, just a voice hanging in the air, waiting. He took a step back, then another. The voice repeated. It did not get louder or softer. It did not change at all. It was exactly the same, as if it were a recording playing over and over. He turned and started walking, not running but moving fast, trying to put distance between himself and that voice. It followed him. Not physically. There was still no sound of pursuit. But every few minutes, from somewhere behind him or to the side or sometimes ahead, his name would drift through the trees. Always the same. Always waiting. He walked for hours. Later he would not be able to explain how he found his way out. He just kept moving, kept putting one foot in front of the other, kept refusing to answer no matter how strong the urge became. Because there was an urge. That was the part that disturbed him most when he tried to describe it later. He had wanted to answer, not out of fear or confusion, but out of something deeper, something that felt almost like obligation. As if not responding was rude, as if someone genuinely needed him and he was ignoring them. It felt wrong to stay silent. It felt like a betrayal. But he did stay silent, and eventually he stumbled out onto a logging road he recognized, and he followed it back to town. He did not talk about it for weeks. When he finally did, he spoke carefully, choosing his words like someone navigating a minefield. He said he had heard something. He said he had not answered. He said people should remember the rule. Then he stopped talking about it entirely. After that there were others. Not many. The rule was strong and people followed it. But every few years someone would come back from the woods with the same look in their eyes, the same careful way of speaking, the same insistence that the rule was important. They never gave details. They never explained what had happened or what they had seen. They just said they had heard their name, and they had not answered, and everyone should keep doing the same. The conversations would end there. It was as if speaking more than that might invite something back, might open a door that should stay closed. So people nodded and agreed and taught their children the rule, and life went on. The hunting season brought new people to the area every year. Outsiders who rented cabins and bought supplies and headed into the woods with rifles and bright orange vests. Most of them were respectful. They followed the posted signs. They stayed on the trails during off hours. They checked in with the local authorities. But there were always a few who thought they knew better, who saw the forest as just another piece of wilderness, no different from any other place they had hunted, who heard the rule and laughed it off as local color, a ghost story to tell around the campfire. Those were the ones who sometimes came back changed. If they came back at all. One hunter, a man from the city who had come up with a group of friends for a weekend trip, decided to stay out after sunset to track a deer he had wounded. His friends tried to stop him. They reminded him of what the locals had said, the warnings they had received when they checked into their cabin. He waved them off. He said he was not about to let an animal suffer just because of some backward superstition. He said he would be back in an hour. He took his flashlight and his rifle and he walked into the trees as the last light drained from the sky. His friends waited. An hour passed, then 2, then 3. They called his phone but got no signal. They shouted his name into the forest but heard nothing back. Eventually they drove into town and found a sheriff, a woman who had lived in the area her entire life and had the kind of face that showed she had seen things she would rather forget. She listened to their story without expression. Then she asked them if their friend knew the rule. They said yes, but he had not believed it. She nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she already knew. She said she would organize a search at first light. She said there was nothing anyone could do in the dark. She did not say why, but the way she said it made the friends decide not to ask. They found him 2 days later, sitting at the base of a tree less than a mile from where he had entered the forest. He was alive, physically unharmed. But when they approached him, when they called his name and touched his shoulder and asked if he was all right, he did not respond. He just stared ahead, his eyes focused on something no one else could see. They brought him back to town. They took him to the small medical clinic. The doctor examined him and found nothing wrong. No injuries. No signs of exposure or dehydration. His vitals were normal. But he would not speak. He would not eat. He would not acknowledge anyone around him. They kept him for observation, thinking maybe he was in shock, that he just needed time to process whatever had happened out there. But days passed and nothing changed. Eventually his friends had to leave. They had jobs to get back to, lives that could not be put on hold indefinitely. They left him in the care of the local hospital, promising to return, promising to figure out what to do. They never did. A month later he walked out of the hospital in the middle of the night. No one saw him leave. No one knew where he went. Some people claimed they saw him heading toward the tree line, but by the time anyone thought to look for him, he was gone. They searched, of course. They found his hospital gown hanging from a branch just inside the forest, as if he had shed it like a snake sheds its skin. But there was no trace of him beyond that. No footprints. No trail. Nothing. It was as if the woods had simply swallowed him whole. The thing about the voice was that it never threatened. It never chased. It never demanded. It just called. Patiently. Persistently. As if it had all the time in the world and knew that eventually you would answer. Because that was what people did when someone called their name. They responded. It was instinct. It was courtesy. It was human nature. And whatever was out there in the woods, whatever was using those voices, It understood that. It understood that the hardest thing in the world was to hear your name and stay silent. It understood that there was a part of every person that wanted to answer, that needed to answer, that felt compelled to answer even when every rational thought screamed not to. And it used that. It weaponized politeness. It turned good manners into a trap. It made you feel guilty for not responding, made you feel cruel for ignoring what sounded like someone who might need help. And in that guilt, in that moment of hesitation, it found its opening. There was a woman who lived on the outskirts of town, in a small house that backed up to the forest. She had lived there her whole life, raised her children there, buried her husband in the cemetery on the other side of town, and come back to the house alone. She knew the rule better than anyone. She had taught it to her children and her grandchildren. She had seen what happened to people who forgot or ignored it. So when she heard her name one autumn evening, spoken clearly from somewhere in the trees behind her house, she knew exactly what it was. She was standing in her kitchen, washing dishes, when the voice drifted through the open window. Her name. Just once. She froze, her hand still in the soapy water, and she waited. It came again. Same tone. Same careful pronunciation. She dried her hand slowly, deliberately, and walked to the window. She did not look out. She just closed it. Then she closed every other window in the house. She drew every curtain. She locked every door. And she sat in her living room with the lights off and waited. The voice continued through the night. Sometimes it was close, right outside her door. Sometimes it was farther away, coming from deep in the trees. But it never stopped. It called her name over and over, with the patience of something that had no concept of time or exhaustion. She sat in her chair and listened and did not answer. She had learned long ago that the urge to respond would pass if you could just outlast it. It was like holding your breath underwater. Painful. Difficult. But possible. The key was not to panic. The key was to remember that no matter how strong the compulsion felt, it was not real. It was not your friend calling. It was not your family needing help. It was something else wearing their voice like a mask. And if you remembered that, if you held on to that knowledge like a lifeline, you could survive. By morning the voice was gone. She opened her curtains and looked out at the forest. Everything looked normal. The sun was shining. Birds were singing. There was no sign that anything had been there at all. But she knew. She had heard it. And she knew that it would be back. Maybe not tonight. Maybe not this week or this month. But eventually it would return. It always did. She wrote about it in her journal that day, something she had never done before. She wrote down exactly what she had heard, how it had made her feel, the overwhelming urge to answer that had nearly broken her resolve. She wrote that she was getting older, that her mind was not as sharp as it once was, and that she was afraid. Afraid that one night she might forget. That one night she might be confused enough or tired enough or lonely enough that she would answer without thinking. She hid the journal in a drawer, hoping someone would find it after she was gone, hoping it might help them understand. The children in town grew up with the stories embedded in their consciousness like a second language. They learned the rule before they learned to read. They practiced it the way other children practiced fire drills. If you hear your name in the woods after dark, what do? You do not answer. You do not turn around. You walk away. The teachers at the school made them recite it until it was automatic, until it was muscle memory, until the response was hardwired into their brains so deeply that even in a moment of panic or confusion, they would know what to do. Some parents thought it was excessive. Some thought it was cruel to frighten children with ghost stories and superstitions. But those parents were usually newcomers, people who had moved to the area from somewhere else and had not yet learned that the rule was not a story. It was survival. The school had a program, understood by everyone, where older students would mentor younger ones about the forest. They would take them to the edge of the tree line during the day and show them where it was safe to play and where they should never go. They would tell them stories, carefully edited versions of real events, designed to convey the seriousness without causing nightmares. They would practice scenarios. What do you do if you are playing near the woods and hear your name? What do you do if you are walking home from a friend's house and the sun is setting? What do you do if you are camping with your family and something calls to you from the darkness? The answers were always the same. Do not answer. Do not investigate. Get to safety. Tell an adult. The children took it seriously in the way children often do with rules that adults enforce with absolute conviction. They might not understand why, but they understood that breaking the rule was dangerous in a way that went beyond getting in trouble. One spring, a group of teenagers decided to test the rule. They were that age where everything adults said seemed designed to control them, where rebellion felt like a moral imperative. They had grown up with the warnings, had heard the stories, had seen the way their parents and teachers talked about the forest with a kind of reverence that bordered on fear. And they were tired of it. They were tired of being afraid of something they had never seen, something that might not even exist. So they made a plan. They would go into the woods after dark. They would call each other's names. They would prove that there was nothing out there, that the whole thing was just a way to keep kids scared and obedient. They waited until a Friday night when there was no moon, when the darkness would be absolute. They met at the edge of the forest, 6 of them, all carrying flashlights and phones and the kind of bravado that comes from safety in numbers. They walked in together, laughing and joking, their voices loud in the quiet of the trees. They went deep, deeper than any of them had been before, until the lights from town were no longer visible and the only sound was their own breathing and the crunch of their footsteps on fallen leaves. Then they started calling, each one shouting the other's names, trying to make it sound real, trying to summon whatever was supposed to be out here. Nothing happened. They called louder. They spread out, moving just far enough apart that they could still see each other's flashlights but not their faces. They kept calling. And finally, one of them heard it. Not his own name. Someone else's. But the voice was wrong. It was not one of his friends. It was not anyone he recognized. It was just a voice, speaking his friend's name with that same careful pronunciation, that same even tone. He stopped shouting. He turned his flashlight toward where the voice had come from. Nothing. Just trees and darkness. The voice came again. Closer this time. He backed up, his heart suddenly pounding, all his earlier confidence evaporating like steam. He looked for his friends. Their flashlights had spread out more than he realized. He could barely see them now, just distant points of light bobbing between the trees. He opened his mouth to call to them, but before he could, he heard his own name, spoken from somewhere behind him. He ran. He did not think about it. He did not try to be brave. He just ran, crashing through the underbrush, his flashlight bouncing. All 6 of them. But they did not make it out together. Each one stumbled onto a road or a trail or someone's backyard separately, each one looking like they had seen death itself. And when they were finally reunited, when their parents had picked them up and brought them home and sat them down to ask what had happened, none of them could fully explain it. They just said they had heard their names. They said they had run. They said they would never go back, but the strange thing, the thing that kept them awake at night for weeks afterward, was that they could not remember whose voice had called them. They knew it was not any of their friends. They knew it was not anyone they recognized. But when they tried to recall what it had sounded like, tried to describe the tone or the accent or any identifying feature, their minds went blank. It was as if the memory had been scrubbed clean, leaving only the emotion behind. The fear, the wrongness, the absolute certainty that whatever had called their names was not human and had no business knowing who they were. They stopped talking about it after a while. Not because they had forgotten or moved on, but because they realized that talking about it made it worse. It made the memory sharper. It made the fear come back. So they kept it to themselves, each one carrying the experience like a scar they could not show anyone. Years later, when they had graduated and moved away and started their own lives, they would still think about that night. They would still remember the sound of their names being called from the darkness. And they would still follow the rule, even hundreds of miles away from that forest. Because some lessons are written too deep to ever fade. The forest itself seemed to change over the years. Or maybe it was just that people became more aware of it. There were places deep in the woods where the undergrowth grew in strange patterns, circles of dead vegetation surrounded by healthy trees, as if something had been sitting there for a very long time. There were trees with marks on them, deep gouges in the bark that looked almost like letters but were not quite coherent enough to read. There were areas where animals refused to go, where even birds avoided flying overhead. People who studied such things, ecologists and biologists and park rangers, would visit occasionally and take samples and measurements and notes. They would leave with data that showed nothing unusual, nothing that could not be explained by normal environmental factors. But they would also leave quickly. They would pack up their equipment faster than they had unpacked it. They would get into their vehicles and drive away without looking back. And if you asked them what they had found, they would say nothing. Just the forest. Just trees. But their eyes would say something different. One research team had come through 5 years ago, sent by a university to study old growth patterns and biodiversity. They set up camp deep in the woods, planning to stay for 2 weeks. They left after 3 days. When pressed for details by their department head, the lead researcher would only say that the site was unsuitable for long-term study. When pushed further, she admitted that every member of the team had heard their names called at various times during their stay. She said it with the kind of resignation that comes from knowing no one will believe you, but also knowing that the truth is more important than credibility. The university never sent another team. The town had a cemetery that dated back to the founding, rows of weathered headstones marking the graves of settlers and their descendants. There was a section in the back, older than the rest, where the stones were so worn that the names were barely legible. People avoided that section, not because it was creepy or unkempt, but because of the way the trees grew around it. They leaned in, their branches reaching over the graves like hands. There was a section in the back, older than the rest, where the stones were so worn that the names were barely legible. People avoided that section, not because it was creepy or unkempt, but because of the way the trees grew around it. They leaned in, their branches reaching over the graves like hands, their roots pushing up through the earth and wrapping around the stones. And on certain nights, when the wind was right, you could hear sounds coming from that direction. Not voices, exactly. More like echoes. Like someone was speaking just far enough away that you could not make out the words, but close enough that you knew they were there. The groundskeeper, an old man who had tended the cemetery for 40 years, refused to work in that section after dark. He said once, to a friend over drinks, that he had heard his name called from those trees one evening while he was finishing up. He had not answered. He had put his tools away and left immediately. And he never stayed past sunset again. He also mentioned something else, something he made his friend promise never to repeat. He said that sometimes, when he was working in that section during the day, he would find footprints around the graves. Human footprints, or close enough. But they were wrong. The spacing was off. The depth was inconsistent. And they would circle the same grave over and over, as if something had been walking around it repeatedly, trying to figure something out. He said he had tried to convince himself it was teenagers or vandals, but the prints were always there in the morning, fresh in the dew, and they never led anywhere. They would just start at one point and end at another, with no indication of how whatever made them had arrived or left. There was a theory, never spoken aloud but understood by those who had lived in the area long enough, that the thing in the woods was not one entity but many. That it was not a creature or a spirit but something more fundamental, something that existed in the spaces between perception and reality. Some thought it was a manifestation of the forest itself, the accumulated consciousness of centuries of growth and decay, of life and death, of all the things that had walked beneath those trees and never walked out. Others thought it was older than that, something that had been here before the first tree sprouted, something that had claimed this land long before humans arrived and would still be here long after they were gone. But whatever it was, however many of them there were, they all did the same thing. They called. They waited. They tried to make you answer. And they never, ever forgot a name they had learned. There were documented cases of people hearing their names called decades apart. A man who had heard his name as a teenager and again as a middle-aged adult, both times in the same forest, both times with the same unchanging voice. A woman who had heard her name in 3 different states, always near wooded areas, always with that same careful pronunciation. As if something was following them, or perhaps as if there were many somethings, all connected somehow, all sharing information about who they had found and who they wanted. The most disturbing accounts came not from those who had heard the voice and resisted, but from those who had heard it and almost answered. There was a man who had been walking his dog one evening, just at the edge of town where the houses met the trees. His dog had started barking, pulling at the leash, desperate to go back home. He had ignored it, thinking the animal had seen a deer or a rabbit. Then he heard his name, clear and close. He had actually opened his mouth. He had actually drawn breath to respond. But his dog had lunged so hard at that moment that it pulled him off balance, and in the second it took him to recover, the spell broke. He realized what he had been about to do. He ran home, his dog racing ahead of him, and he did not stop until he was inside with the door locked. He said later that what frightened him most was not the voice itself, but how natural it had seemed. How easy it would have been to answer. How close he had come to doing exactly what the rule said never to do. He said he could not trust himself anymore. He could not trust that if it happened again, he would be strong enough to resist. After that incident, he got rid of his dog. Not because he blamed the animal, but because he knew that next time, he might not have that interruption. He might. And he never walked alone after dark again. There was a woman who heard her daughter's voice calling from the woods behind her house. Her daughter was away at college, hundreds of miles from home. But the voice sounded exactly like her. Same tone, same inflection, even the same slight lisp she had never quite grown out of. The woman had grabbed her coat and was halfway to the back door before she remembered. Before she stopped and thought and realized that her daughter was not here, could not be here, and that whatever was calling from those trees was not her child. She stood in her hallway, shaking, tears running down her face, listening to that voice call for her over and over. "Mom. Mom, please. I need you." It went on for hours. She did not answer. She did not go outside. But she never felt like a good mother again after that night. Never stopped wondering if somehow, impossibly, it really had been her daughter and she had ignored her when she needed help. Logically, she knew it was not true. But logic had nothing to do with the guilt that ate at her every day afterward. She called her daughter that night, waking her up despite the late hour, just to hear her voice and confirm she was safe. Her daughter was annoyed at being woken, groggy and confused. But the woman did not explain. She just said she wanted to check in, said she loved her, and let her go back to sleep. After that, she called her daughter every night for a month, always at the same time, always with some excuse. Her daughter thought she was being overprotective, maybe having a midlife crisis. She never knew that her mother was calling to prove to herself that her daughter was real, that the voice in the forest had been a lie, that she had made the right choice by not answering. The pattern was always the same. The voice would come at dusk or later, never in full daylight. It would use a name, always a name, never anything generic or vague. It would sound normal, not scary, not threatening, just a regular voice calling out as if trying to get someone's attention. And it would repeat. It would keep trying, with the patience of something that had no deadlines, no urgency, no reason to give up. Some people heard it once and never again. Others heard it multiple times over the years, as if whatever was out there had marked them, remembered them, and kept coming back. No one knew why some people were targeted more than others. There was no pattern to it, no common thread that connected the victims. Old and young, men and women, locals and visitors. It did not discriminate. It just called. But there were theories. Some thought it was attracted to people who were alone, isolated, vulnerable. Others thought it could sense fear or doubt, that it knew somehow who would be most likely to answer. Still others believed it was completely random, that it called to everyone at some point, but only some people were in the right place at the right time to hear it. The truth, if there was one, remained hidden. Like so many things about the forest, it was a mystery that refused to be solved. The sheriff kept a private log of incidents. Nothing official. Nothing that would go in reports or records. Just a notebook she kept in her desk drawer, where she wrote down every account of someone hearing their name in the woods. She had started it years ago, when she first took the job, thinking maybe she could find a pattern, figure out what was really happening. But the more entries she added, the less sense it made. There was no pattern. No explanation. Just page after page of people describing the same experience, the same voice, the same overwhelming urge to answer. She had heard her own name 3 times over the years. Once when she was a teenager, sneaking out to meet friends. Once when she was responding to a missing person call and had to search the forest. And once 2 years ago, when she was standing in her own backyard looking at the stars. Each time she had not answered. Each time she had walked away. But each time it got harder. Not easier. Harder. As if whatever was calling was learning, adapting, getting better at mimicking something human. The third time, the voice had included an inflection she recognized. A slight rise at the end that her father had always used when he called her name. Her father had been dead for 10 years. The thing in the forest should not have known that. Should not have been able to reproduce it so perfectly, but it had. And in that moment, standing in her backyard under the stars, she had wanted more than anything to answer. To hear that inflection again. To pretend for just a moment that her father was still alive and calling her home. She had not answered, but it had been close. Closer than she ever wanted to be again. There were nights when the entire town seemed to hold its breath. When the wind would die down and the air would grow heavy and everyone would go inside earlier than usual without quite knowing why. On those nights, people would hear things. Not just from the forest, but from everywhere. Names called from empty streets. Voices coming from houses that were supposed to be vacant. The sound of someone knocking on doors that no one was standing behind. The town would go quiet on those nights. Lights would go off early. No one would answer their doors. No one would go outside. And in the morning everything would be back to normal, as if nothing had happened, except that everyone would be a little more tired, a little more weary, a little more aware that the rule existed for a reason. These nights had no pattern either. They happened maybe 3 or 4 times a year, sometimes more, sometimes less. No one could predict them, but everyone could feel them coming. It was in the air, in the quality of the light, in the way animals behaved. Dogs would refuse to go outside. Cats would hide under furniture. Birds would stop singing hours before they normally would. And people who had lived here long enough would recognize the signs and prepare. They would make sure they had everything they needed for the night. They would check that all their windows and doors were secure. They would gather their families inside. And they would wait for morning. Some people left. They could not handle it anymore, could not stand living in a place where the forest watched and waited and occasionally reached out with a voice that knew their name. They would pack up their belongings and move away, to cities or suburbs or anywhere that felt safe and rational and explainable. But even they would sometimes report hearing things in their new homes. A voice that sounded familiar calling from a place it should not be. A feeling of being watched when they were alone. The sense that something had followed them, or maybe had always been there, waiting for them to let their guard down. Because maybe the thing in the woods was not confined to the woods. Maybe it was everywhere. Maybe the forest was just the one place where people had learned to recognize it, to give it a name and a rule and a way to survive. Maybe everywhere else, people were hearing their names called and answering, never knowing what they were really responding to. There was a man who had moved to the city, as far from the forest as he could get, who swore he heard his name called from an alley one night. He followed the rule. He kept walking. But he said the voice had been the same. Exactly the same as it had been back home. And he wondered if maybe distance meant nothing to whatever this was. If maybe once it knew your name, it could find you anywhere. The old woman who had closed her windows and waited through the night eventually died. Natural causes. Old age. She was 93 and had lived a full life. But at her funeral, people whispered about how she had looked in her final days. How she had kept staring at the window. How she had kept asking if someone was calling her. How in her last moments, she had tried to get out of bed, had tried to walk towards something only she could see, and had said yes, she was coming. She was finally ready to answer. They had stopped her. They had held her down gently, lovingly, and reminded her of the rule. But she had fought them with surprising strength for someone so frail, insisting that it was all right now, that she understood, that she needed to go. She died still reaching toward that invisible something, and they buried her in the old section of the cemetery, where the trees leaned in close and the roots wrapped around the stones. And some people swore they could hear her name being called from those trees on quiet nights, over and over, still waiting for an answer. Her journal was found in the drawer where she had hidden it, filled with entries about the voice, about the fear, about the constant vigilance required to resist. The last entry, written just days before her death, said simply that she was tired, that she had been fighting for so long and she did not know if she could keep fighting, that maybe answering would not be so bad, that maybe whatever was calling just wanted to talk. Her family burned the journal after reading it, afraid that keeping it might invite something into their own homes. The teenagers who had tested the rule grew into adults who taught their own children about it. They did not tell their kids what had happened to them that night in the forest. They did not share the details of how they had run or how terrified they had been. They just taught the rule, the same way it had been taught to them, with firmness and certainty and no room for questions. And their children would roll their eyes the way children do, thinking their parents were being overprotective or superstitious or old-fashioned. But they would learn. Eventually they would all learn. Because the forest was patient. It had time. And sooner or later, everyone who lived near it would hear their name called from the darkness. Everyone would face that moment of decision. Answer or walk away. Trust the voice or trust the rule. And in that moment, they would understand why the rule existed. They would understand that some knowledge cannot be taught, only experienced. They would understand that real fear does not come from things that attack. Real fear comes from things that know you. There was a researcher, a folklorist from out of state, who came to study the phenomenon. She interviewed dozens of people, recorded their stories, took detailed notes. She approached it all with academic detachment, treating it as an interesting cultural quirk, a shared delusion born from isolation and tradition. She spent weeks in town, visiting the library, talking to residents, walking the perimeter of the forest during the day. She was respectful but skeptical, the way academics often are when confronted with local beliefs that do not fit into rational frameworks. She said she wanted to understand the psychological and sociological factors that had created and sustained this particular myth. People warned her. They told her the rule was not a myth. They told her that if she heard her name, she should not answer. She smiled and thanked them and wrote everything down in her notebook. Then one evening, as she was walking back to her hotel from the library, she passed too close to the tree line. The sun had just set. The sky was that deep purple that comes right before full dark. And she heard her name. She stopped walking. Later she would describe it as the most ordinary sound she had ever heard. Not frightening at all. Just someone calling her name, the way a friend might call to get her attention in a crowded room. She turned toward the sound, ready to see who it was. But there was no one there. Just the trees, their branches swaying slightly in the evening breeze. Her name came again. Same tone. Same volume. She felt her skin prickle. She felt something cold settle in her stomach. Because she recognized it now. She recognized the too perfect pronunciation, the lack of breath, the absence of any ambient sound that should have accompanied a human voice. She remembered the rule. She turned away from the forest and walked quickly back to her hotel. She did not run. She did not panic. But she walked fast, and she did not look back. She left town the next morning. She sent an email to her department saying the project was not viable, that the data was insufficient, that she was pursuing other research interests. She never published anything about her time here. She never spoke about what she had heard. But 6 months later, she sent a letter to the sheriff, the one who kept the private log. In it, she apologized. She said she had been wrong to dismiss the stories, wrong to treat them as folklore instead of warning. She said she still heard her name sometimes, late at night when she was alone in her apartment. She said she never answered. She said she never would. But she also said she did not know how long she could keep that promise. The letter ended with a simple request. If anything ever happened to her, if she ever disappeared or was found in circumstances that could not be explained, the sheriff should know that she had broken the rule, that she had answered. The sheriff filed the letter with all the others and hoped she would never have to use it. The local school eventually created a formal curriculum around the rule. It was taught in every grade, age-appropriate versions that grew more detailed and serious as children got older. In kindergarten, they learned it as a simple safety rule, like looking both ways before crossing the street. Do not talk to strangers. Do not play with fire. Do not answer if you hear your name in the woods. In middle school, they learned the history, or at least as much of the history as anyone knew. They learned about the incidents, the people who had heard the voice, the importance of staying vigilant. In high school, they learned about the psychology of it, the way the voice exploited human instinct and social conditioning, the techniques for resisting the urge to respond. Some people from outside the area criticized the school for teaching superstition instead of science. But those criticisms came from people who had never lived here, who had never heard their names spoken from the darkness, who had never felt that overwhelming compulsion to answer something that sounded so perfectly human. The people who lived here knew better. They knew that this was not superstition. This was preparation. This was survival. There were support groups, unofficial gatherings of people who had heard the voice and lived to talk about it. They met once a month in the back room of the library, just a handful of people sitting in a circle, sharing their experiences. No one advertised the meetings. You found out about them by word of mouth, usually from someone who thought you needed them. The conversations were quiet, careful, full of long pauses where people tried to find words for things that did not have words. They talked about the fear, yes, but also about the other things. The guilt, the shame, the feeling that maybe they had done something wrong by not answering, even though they knew rationally that staying silent had saved them. They talked about the dreams they had afterward, dreams where they answered the voice and terrible things happened, or sometimes dreams where they answered and nothing happened at all, which was somehow worse. They talked about the hypervigilance, the way they now flinched at any unexpected sound, the way they could not go anywhere after dark without feeling watched. And they talked about the voice itself, trying to understand what it was, what it wanted, why it did what it did. No one ever came up with answers. But there was comfort in knowing they were not alone, that other people had gone through the same thing and survived. The most recent incident happened 3 months ago. A young couple had moved to town, drawn by the low cost of living and the promise of a quiet life away from the chaos of the city. They had heard about the rule, of course. Everyone told them. But they thought it was charming, in a way. Quirky local folklore. Something to tell their friends back home about. They rented a house near the edge of town, close enough to the forest that they could see the trees from their bedroom window. They loved it at first. The peace. The stars at night. The sound of wind in the branches. Then one evening the woman heard her name. She was alone. Her partner had gone into town for groceries. She was making dinner, humming to herself, when the voice drifted through the window. Her name. Clear and unmistakable. She froze, the knife still in her hand. Her first thought was that her partner had come back, was calling to her from outside. But his car was not in the driveway. She went to the window and looked out. Nothing. Just the trees, swaying slightly in the breeze. The voice came again. Same tone, same pronunciation. She felt something cold settle in her stomach. She remembered the rule. She stepped back from the window. The voice called again and again. She stood in her kitchen, alone, listening to something that sounded exactly like a human being call her name over and over, and she did not answer. When her partner came home an hour later, he found her sitting on the floor with her back against the wall, pale and shaking. She told him what had happened. He believed her immediately. He did not question or doubt or try to rationalize. He just helped her up and held her and said they would figure it out. But that night, lying in bed, he heard his own name called from outside. And he understood they still live there. They have not moved. But they do not open their windows after dark anymore. They do not go outside once the sun sets. And they do not answer when they hear their names called from the forest. Because they have learned what everyone who lives here eventually learns. The rule is not a suggestion. It is not folklore or superstition or small-town paranoia. It is survival. It is the one thing standing between you and something that wants very badly for you to respond. The woman started having nightmares after that first night. Dreams where she answered the voice and walked into the forest, where the trees closed in around her and she could never find her way back out. Dreams where she answered and something stepped out of the darkness, something that wore a human shape but was not human at all. Dreams where she answered and nothing happened, where she just stood there calling back into the void and getting no response, which filled her with a loneliness so profound it felt like drowning. She started seeing a therapist, someone from the next town over who had experience with trauma. The therapist listened and nodded and prescribed medication for anxiety and sleep. But the therapist also asked, carefully, if the woman had considered moving. If maybe distance from the source of the trauma would help. The woman said she had considered it. But she also said she was afraid that moving would not help. That whatever was in the forest might follow her. Or worse, that it was already everywhere, and the forest was just the one place where people knew to be afraid. Her partner tried to be supportive. He installed better locks on all the doors and windows. He bought heavy curtains that blocked out any view of the trees. He suggested they get a dog, something to alert them if anything came too close to the house. But he also started drinking more. Started staying up late, sitting in the living room with the lights off, watching the window. He said he was keeping watch, making sure they were safe. But really he was waiting to hear his name again. Waiting to see if he could resist the urge to answer. The voice had only called to him once, that first night. But he could not stop thinking about it. Could not stop replaying that moment in his head, analyzing every aspect of the sound, trying to understand what it had been. He started researching online, looking for similar phenomena in other parts of the world. He found stories from every continent, every culture, every time period. Stories of voices in the wilderness that called people by name. Stories of those who answered and were never seen again. Stories of those who resisted and spent the rest of their lives wondering what would have happened if they had given in. He compiled everything into a document, hundreds of pages of accounts and analysis and theory. And in doing so, he started to see patterns. Not in when or where it happened, but in what happened after. The people who heard the voice and did not answer often reported similar effects. Hypervigilance, anxiety, a sense of being watched, but also something else, a feeling of incompleteness, as if by not answering, they had left something unfinished, as if there was a conversation that had been started but never concluded. And that feeling never went away. It just became part of who they were. The town council met quarterly to discuss various administrative matters, and in every meeting, someone brought up the forest. New signage was proposed and approved. Warning signs posted at every trailhead and access point. The signs were carefully worded, trying to convey the seriousness of the danger without sounding insane to outsiders who might read them. They settled on simple language. Stay on marked trails. Do not enter after dark. If you hear unusual sounds, leave the area immediately and report to local authorities. It was not perfect. It did not mention the rule explicitly, but it was something. The council also discussed whether to close the forest entirely, to restrict access and keep people out. But that idea was always voted down. The forest was too big, too wild, too impossible to fence or patrol. And besides, closing it would raise questions they did not want to answer. It would draw attention from outside, from reporters and investigators and curiosity seekers. It would turn their town into a spectacle. So they compromised. They warned people as best they could. They taught their children. They maintained the rule. And they hoped it would be enough. There was a journalist who came through town once, working on a piece about rural life in modern times. She interviewed people at the diner, at the general store, at the gas station on the edge of town. And inevitably, someone mentioned the forest and the rule. She asked about it, her recorder running, her pen poised over her notebook. People were hesitant at first, but eventually they told her. They told her about the voice. They told her about the people who had heard it. They told her about the importance of not answering. She listened and nodded and wrote it all down. Then she asked if anyone would take her into the forest, show her where these incidents happened. No one would. She offered money. She promised it would only be during the day, that they would not stay long. Still, no one agreed. Finally, she said she would go alone. She was told not to. She was warned, clearly and repeatedly, about the dangers. She smiled and said she understood, but she had a job to do. She went in alone one afternoon, carrying her camera and recorder and notebook. She came back 3 hours later, pale and silent. She did not stay for dinner. She did not finish her interviews. She packed her equipment into her car and drove away, and the article about rural life was never published. A year later, someone from town happened to see her at a conference in another state. They asked if she remembered her visit, if she ever finished that article. She said no. She said some stories were not meant to be told. She said she had heard something in the forest that day, something that knew her name, and she had followed the rule. She had not answered. But she also said she had learned something important. She had learned that there are places in the world where the old rules still apply, where the things that science and reason have tried to explain away are still very much real. And she had learned that sometimes, the best thing a journalist can do is stay silent. The annual town festival was held every summer, a weekend of food and music and games that drew visitors from surrounding counties. It was a time of celebration, of community, of forgetting for a little while about the things that lived in the shadows. But even during the festival, even with hundreds of people gathered in the town square, laughing and eating and enjoying themselves, no one stayed out after dark. As the sun began to set, the crowds would thin. Families would pack up and head home. Vendors would close their booths. And by the time full darkness fell, the square would be empty. Visitors sometimes remarked on this, asked why the festival did not continue into the evening, why there were no fireworks or night concerts or any of the usual festivities that came with such events. The answer was always the same. This is just how we do things here. And if the visitors pressed, if they asked more questions or expressed confusion, someone would eventually tell them about the rule. Some visitors laughed it off. Some thought it was part of the local charm, an act put on for tourists. But some visitors listened carefully. And those visitors always left before dark. There was an old recording, made decades ago, that circulated among long-time residents. No one knew who had made it or why, but everyone had heard it at some point. It was just audio, no video, recorded on what sounded like old magnetic tape. The quality was poor, full of static and background noise. But you could hear it clearly enough. A voice, calling a name. The same name, over and over, with that characteristic even tone and careful pronunciation. The recording lasted about 5 minutes. 5 minutes of the same name being called into the void, with no response, no other sound, no indication of where or when it had been captured. People who listened to it reported feeling uncomfortable, even though it was just a recording, even though they were safe in their homes with the doors locked and the lights on. They reported feeling that same compulsion, that urge to answer, even though the voice was not calling their name. As if whatever was on that recording was not just the sound but something more, something that could reach through time and space and technology to create that effect. The recording was eventually lost or destroyed, depending on who you asked. Some said it was for the best. That having a record of the voice, even a poor quality one, was dangerous. That it gave the thing a permanence it should not have. Others regretted its loss. They thought it could have been studied, analyzed, used to understand what they were dealing with. But either way, it was gone. All that remained were the memories of those who had heard it, and the uneasy feeling it had left behind. The local library had a section in the basement, not open to the public, where they kept old records and documents related to the town's history. Among these was a collection of journals and letters, some dated back over 100 years, that mentioned the forest and the voice. The language changed over the decades, the descriptions varied, but the core experience remained the same. Someone heard their name. Someone felt compelled to answer. Someone chose to stay silent, or someone chose to respond and was never quite the same afterward. The librarian, a middle-aged woman who had taken over the position from her mother, had read every document in that collection. She had spent years trying to find a pattern, trying to trace the phenomenon back to its origin. But the trail always went cold. The oldest documents referenced even older stories, oral traditions that had never been written down, warnings that predated the founding of the town itself. Whatever this was, it had been here long before anyone had thought to record it. And it would likely be here long after the last record crumbled to dust. The phenomenon had affected the local economy in subtle ways. Property values were lower here than in comparable rural areas. Businesses struggled to attract employees from outside the region. Tourism was minimal, despite the natural beauty of the area. Young people left for college and rarely came back. The population was slowly declining, not dramatically, but steadily, year after year. There were discussions about what could be done, how the town could revitalize itself, attract new residents and businesses. But those discussions always came back to the same problem. How do you sell people on a place where the forest calls your name and you must never answer? How do you convince someone to raise their children here, to build a life here, when there is a rule that must be followed or else? Some people argued for honesty, for telling newcomers everything up front and letting them make informed decisions. Others argued for discretion, for letting people discover the truth gradually, after they had already invested in the community and were less likely to leave. Neither approach worked particularly well. The town remained small, isolated, known only to those who lived there and those who had heard the stories, and still the forest waited, patient and eternal. The trees grew and died and grew again. The seasons changed. Animals made their homes in the undergrowth. Streams ran clear and cold. On the surface, it was just a forest. Just trees and earth and sky. But those who lived nearby knew better. They knew that something else lived there too. Something that watched and listened and learned. Something that collected names the way others collect memories. Something that called out in the darkness, over and over, with the patience of stone and the persistence of water. Something that never threatened but never stopped trying. And as long as people lived near this forest, as long as they walked beneath these trees, they would hear their names called. They would feel that urge to answer. They would have to choose, in that moment of decision, whether to trust their instincts or trust the rule. Whether to believe that the voice was human or believe that it was something else wearing humanity like a mask. And their survival would depend on making the right choice, because if you value your life, your sanity, your very sense of self, you will follow the rule. You will not answer. You will not turn around. You will walk away. Because whatever is out there in the darkness, whatever knows your name and calls it with such careful precision, is not your friend. It is not your family. It is not anyone who wishes you well. It is something else. Something that understands humans just well enough to mimic them, but not quite enough to be convincing. Something that sees you not as a person but as a puzzle to be solved, a code to be cracked. And the only defense you have is silence. The only protection is the rule. If you hear your name called in the woods after dark, do not answer. This is not your name anymore. This is a trap.